Ma'am, this area is restricted.
I'm on staff. What's the issue?
Staff must have ID visible.
Others just walk through without badges.
They were cleared. I need to see yours.
At precisely 6:15 a.m. on a Wednesday morning at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Baltimore, a security officer named Blake Mercer made the worst choice of his professional career. He stopped a black woman wearing scrubs and insisted on seeing her identification. What he didn't realize was that the woman standing before him wasn't just any physician. She was Dr. Alicia Hammond, the chief medical officer, a board member, and the individual who literally authorized his paychecks. The surveillance footage would later be reviewed by the hospital board, employment lawyers, and eventually become mandatory training material for every security company working in medical facilities across 3 states. In 12 minutes, Blake's career would be finished. Within 6 months, the hospital would pay $850,000 to resolve a discrimination lawsuit. And within a year, security procedures at 17 hospitals would be entirely rewritten because of what was about to unfold. But at that moment, standing in the hallway near the ICU entrance, Blake had no clue. He only knew he didn't like the tone of this woman who was challenging his authority. He was about to discover that some people carry attitudes because they're tired of being treated like suspects in their own workplace. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. This story gets absolutely crazy, and you'll want to see how it ends. Dr. Alicia Hammond was far from your typical 44-year-old physician. While many doctors her age were focused on their specialty, or maybe advancing to department leadership, Alicia was overseeing the entire hospital's medical operations. But what truly set her apart was this. She wasn't just a skilled administrator who climbed the ranks. Alicia was a Harvard-trained cardiothoracic surgeon who had completed more than 3,000 open-heart procedures before transitioning into hospital leadership. She held 2 master's degrees, one in public health and another in business administration. She had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine 17 times. Her research on reducing surgical complications among minority patients had transformed protocols in hospitals nationwide. As chief medical officer, Alicia supervised every clinical department, every medical decision, every doctor, nurse, and staff member in a hospital that treated over 150,000 patients annually. She was responsible for a medical team of 800 physicians and a clinical budget of $340 million. The hospital board reported to her on all medical matters. The CEO sought her advice on strategic decisions. By any standard, she was one of the most powerful individuals in that building. She was also one of only 12 black female chief medical officers at major hospitals across the entire United States. And she had spent her entire career dealing with people who assumed she didn't belong. On that particular Wednesday, Alicia had been at the hospital since 4:30 a.m. There had been a multi-vehicle crash on Interstate 95. 7 trauma patients had arrived at the same time. Alicia had been in the trauma bay coordinating care, directing surgical teams, making life-saving decisions. She was still in her scrubs. They were stained with blood. Her surgical cap was pushed back. Her badge was clipped to her waistband, partially hidden by her scrub top. She was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, and heading toward the ICU to check on the patients they had just saved. She had walked that corridor thousands of times. She knew every nurse, most of the cleaning staff, and certainly every security guard working the day shift, or so she believed. Blake Mercer was new. He had been hired 3 weeks earlier by the hospital's contracted security company. He had minimal training, just a 2-day orientation that mostly covered where to stand and when to take breaks. No one had informed him about hospital leadership. No one had shown him photos of the chief medical officer. No one had explained that doctors in scrubs don't always have their badges visible, especially after surgery. What Blake did have were assumptions. He had ideas about what doctors should look like. He had assumptions about who belonged in restricted areas and who didn't. And when he saw Alicia walking down that corridor, every one of his assumptions told him she didn't belong there. He called out to her, saying she couldn't be back there, that the area was restricted to medical staff only. Alicia stopped. She turned around. She was used to this. It happened at conferences. It happened at professional gatherings. It even happened in her own hospital more often than anyone should endure. She calmly told him she was medical staff. Her tone was neutral, neither warm nor hostile, just stating a fact. Blake demanded identification. He didn't ask. He demanded. Alicia responded with a question instead of immediately complying. She asked if he needed to see her ID to believe she worked there. It was a pointed question because the implication was obvious. Why was he questioning her presence? What made him assume she didn't belong? Blake fell back on policy. He said hospital rules required everyone to display proper identification in restricted areas. It sounded reasonable except for one issue. It wasn't being enforced consistently. Alicia pointed that out. She had just seen him let 4 people walk through that hallway in the last 2 minutes. None of them had visible ID badges. He hadn't stopped any of them. She asked what made her different from the others who had just passed by. Quick question for you watching. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere you absolutely had the right to be? Type yes or no in the comments. Blake didn't answer. Instead, he escalated. He asked if she was refusing to show identification, trying to shift the blame onto her, turning her hesitation into the issue instead of his selective enforcement. Alicia remained composed. She asked again why she was the only one being stopped. What made her different? The question lingered in the air. Everyone witnessing the interaction knew the answer. Everyone except Blake. Then Blake made his next mistake. He said he didn't have time for this. He told her to show ID, or he would call for backup and have her escorted out. It was meant to intimidate, to force compliance through fear. That's when Alicia dropped the truth. She told him to call his backup, to call his supervisor, to call HR, because in about 5 minutes he would realize he had just demanded identification from the chief medical officer of the entire hospital. The words hit like a shock. You could see it on Blake's face in the footage. His confidence vanished, replaced by uncertainty, then fear. He tried to recover. He said something about not being expected to believe that, but his tone had shifted. The authority was gone. Alicia didn't back down. She said she didn't expect him to believe anything. She expected him to do his job correctly, which included not racially profiling the doctors who worked there. She said it clearly, directly, racial profiling, not hinting at it, not avoiding it, naming it outright. A nurse stepped out from one of the patient rooms. She saw Alicia and began to say good morning. Then she noticed Blake and paused, looking confused. The nurse's name was Jennifer, and she had worked with Alicia for 6 years. She immediately recognized her. Jennifer asked if everything was all right. Alicia said it was fine, but that the security guard had stopped her and demanded identification because apparently she didn't look like she belonged in the medical staff area. Jennifer's jaw dropped. She looked at Blake and said, "You stopped Dr. Hammond." The name clearly meant nothing to Blake. He asked who Dr. Hammond was. Jennifer stared at him in disbelief. She said, "She's the chief medical officer. She runs this entire hospital." Blake's face turned pale. You could see it in the footage. The color drained instantly. He began to stammer an apology. Alicia cut him off. She asked for his name and his supervisor's contact details. Blake provided them, his voice shaking. Alicia took out her phone and made a call. When it was answered, she said, "Tom, it's Alicia. I need you on the 3rd floor ICU corridor immediately. We have a situation that requires urgent attention." Tom was Tom Henderson, the hospital's chief security officer. He had been with St. Catherine's for 12 years. He arrived within 3 minutes. He took one look at the scene, Alicia in blood-stained scrubs with her arms folded, Blake visibly shaken, Jennifer standing nearby, and immediately understood this was serious. Alicia explained everything calmly and clearly. She said Blake had stopped her, demanded identification, and threatened to have her escorted out when she questioned why she was the only one being stopped. She pointed out that he had allowed multiple individuals without visible badges to pass without question. She stated that the only explanation for this selective enforcement was racial profiling. Tom turned to Blake and asked if that account was accurate. Blake tried to explain. He said he was just doing his job, enforcing badge policy. Tom asked if he had stopped anyone else in that corridor. Blake hesitated, then admitted he hadn't. Tom asked why. Blake said he didn't have a good answer. Tom instructed Blake to return to the security office and wait there. Blake walked away, and it was clear from the footage that he knew his job was finished. His shoulders were slumped, no longer the confident authority figure from just minutes earlier. Tom apologized to Alicia. Not a quick apology, but a sincere one. He said the situation was unacceptable and would be handled immediately. Alicia said this wasn't only about her. She had dealt with this throughout her career, but she couldn't allow it in her own hospital. Not to her, not to other doctors of color, not to anyone. She told Tom she wanted a complete review of the security contractor's training procedures. She wanted data on who was being stopped and questioned in restricted areas. She wanted to find out whether there was a pattern, and she expected everything within 48 hours. Tom nodded. He understood. This wasn't a request from a doctor who had been mildly inconvenienced. This was an order from a senior executive who had just experienced discrimination inside her own workplace. The stakes were enormous. Do you think the hospital responded fast enough? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Alicia went to check on her patients. She had 5 individuals in the ICU who required her attention. People who didn't care about badge rules or security procedures. People who simply needed a doctor capable of saving their lives. She set the incident aside and continued doing her job. But she didn't forget. That evening, after a 16-hour shift, Alicia sat down and documented everything that happened, every word spoken, every witness present, the timestamps, the location, the specific discriminatory elements of the encounter. She sent the report to Tom Henderson. She also forwarded it to the hospital CEO, the HR director, the board chair, and her attorney. She wasn't just filing an internal complaint. She was establishing a formal record involving multiple witnesses and stakeholders. The next morning, Tom presented his report. It wasn't good. Over the previous 3 weeks, Blake had stopped 12 individuals in restricted areas and demanded identification. 11 of them were people of color. 8 were women of color. Only 1 was white, and that was a young white man with long hair and tattoos. The pattern was clear. Blake wasn't enforcing hospital policy. He was acting on his own biases about what medical staff should look like. Tom had already revoked Blake's access to the facility and informed the security contractor that Blake was not to return. But Alicia wasn't satisfied with simply firing Blake. She wanted systemic reform. She scheduled a meeting with the CEO, the board chair, the head of HR, and the security contractor's regional manager. During that meeting, she presented data she had personally requested. Over the past year, security stops in restricted areas revealed a clear racial imbalance. Black and Latino staff were stopped and questioned at rates 3 times higher than white staff, even though they made up only 35% of the workforce. The findings were undeniable. It showed this wasn't just Blake, it was a wider issue. The security contractor attempted to defend their training procedures. Alicia shut that down immediately. She stated that if their training produced guards who couldn't recognize the hospital's chief medical officer and who enforced rules selectively based on race, then the training was ineffective. She gave them 2 choices. Completely redesign their training program with input from the hospital's diversity and inclusion team, implement mandatory implicit bias training, establish clear procedures for identifying staff without visible badges, and agree to quarterly audits of their stop data, or risk losing the contract. The contractor chose the first option. They couldn't afford to lose a major hospital client. Within 2 weeks, they developed a new training program. Every guard was required to complete 8 hours of implicit bias training. They were provided with photo directories of hospital leadership. They were trained on how to respectfully verify someone's role without making assumptions based on appearance. But that wasn't the end of the story. Alicia spoke with her attorney about the incident. The attorney pointed out that although Blake had been dismissed and training improved, the hospital itself still held responsibility for the discriminatory environment. The contractor worked under the hospital, and the hospital had oversight. Alicia didn't want to sue her own workplace, but she also understood that without financial consequences, institutions rarely take these matters seriously. She filed a formal EEOC complaint alleging racial discrimination and a hostile work environment. She documented not only this incident with Blake, but also a pattern of similar experiences over her 5 years as CMO. Instances where security questioned her presence in leadership meetings. Times she was mistaken for housekeeping or dietary staff. Moments when her authority was challenged in ways her white male colleagues never faced. All documented, all witnessed, all recorded in emails and incident reports she had submitted to HR. The hospital's legal team reviewed the complaint and knew they had a serious issue. Alicia wasn't an entry-level employee they could ignore. She was the chief medical officer. She had an outstanding reputation. She had evidence. And if the case went to court, a jury would see security footage of a black female doctor in blood-stained scrubs being threatened with removal from her own hospital. The settlement discussions moved quickly. The hospital didn't want public attention. They didn't want other institutions to view them as a place that discriminated against their own leadership. They didn't want doctors of color to hesitate before accepting roles there. 6 months after the incident, a settlement was reached. $850,000 was paid to Alicia. More importantly, the hospital agreed to extensive policy reforms. They created a chief diversity officer role, reporting directly to the CEO. They implemented mandatory bias training for all staff, not just security. They established an independent review board to handle discrimination complaints. They committed to increasing diversity in leadership and tracking demographic data across all levels. Alicia used part of her settlement to create a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in hospital administration. She wanted to ensure the next generation of healthcare leaders would be more diverse, so that one day, people wouldn't assume that black women in hospitals were anything other than the accomplished professionals they are. Blake never worked in security again. His termination for discrimination made it extremely difficult to find employment in the field. The security contractor used his case in training as an example of what not to do. His 12-minute encounter became a warning story. But here's what really matters. Blake was just one individual, but he represented a much larger issue. The security contractor had hired him without adequate training. The hospital had partnered with a company that didn't prioritize properly identifying its own staff. The system allowed this to happen, and it didn't only affect Alicia. How many nurses of color had been stopped and questioned? How many technicians? How many doctors without leadership roles and without the power to push back? The data showed hundreds of cases within a single year. That's what Alicia meant when she said this wasn't just about her. It was about building an environment where everyone, regardless of race, could work without being made to feel like they didn't belong. Let's break down what this story really teaches. On the surface, it's about a security guard who racially profiled his boss and faced consequences. But if that's all you take from it, you're missing the larger message. First lesson, documentation is critical. Alicia didn't just complain verbally. She wrote detailed reports. She requested data. She gathered evidence. She created a record that couldn't be ignored. Without documentation, it becomes one person's word against another. With documentation, it becomes undeniable truth. Second lesson, patterns matter more than isolated events. One guard stopping one doctor might be dismissed as a misunderstanding. But data showing hundreds of discriminatory stops over time reveals a systemic issue. That demands systemic solutions. Alicia understood that fixing the system mattered more than punishing one person. Third lesson, understand your power and use it wisely. Alicia had authority as CMO. She used it, but she didn't stop at getting Blake fired. She used her position to push for institutional change. She ensured the solution went beyond removing one individual. Fourth lesson, financial impact drives change. The hospital paid $850,000. That got leadership's attention. That forced them to take the issue seriously and invest in real solutions. It's unfortunate, but organizations often don't change until there are financial consequences. Fifth lesson, create opportunities for others. Alicia could have taken her settlement and moved on. Instead, she used it to fund a scholarship. She turned a negative experience into something that would benefit future generations. That's how individual incidents create lasting impact. Have you or someone you know faced discrimination at work? Share your experience in the comments if you feel comfortable. The security footage from that morning was never publicly released due to the settlement, but it was used for training. Security companies across the healthcare sector used it as a learning tool. New guards watch it and understand what happens when assumptions based on race replace proper procedure. The footage highlights something important. Alicia never raised her voice. She never became hostile or aggressive. She asked questions. She pointed out inconsistencies. She asserted her authority when necessary. Her professionalism throughout the situation made it impossible for anyone to claim she was being difficult or unreasonable. That's not to say anyone has to be a flawless victim, but it does highlight the strength of remaining composed and recording everything. When you can reference video evidence showing you acting respectfully while facing discrimination, it becomes much harder for others to dismiss your complaint. 3 years after the incident, St. Catherine's Medical Center had made meaningful progress. Their leadership team had become more diverse. Their policies were more defined. Their training had improved. Reports of discriminatory treatment had decreased by 60%. They had been acknowledged by several healthcare organizations for their dedication to diversity and inclusion. But Alicia would tell you the work wasn't complete. Progress doesn't equal perfection. There were still incidents, still complaints, still improvements to be made, but the system was better than before, and that mattered. Blake's story moved in a different direction. After losing his job in security, he struggled for a time. Eventually, he found work in retail. About a year after the incident, he contacted Alicia through LinkedIn. He sent her a message apologizing for what had happened. He said he had spent time reflecting on his own biases. He said he was working to become a better person. Alicia never replied to the message. She later told colleagues she appreciated the apology, but she didn't owe Blake her forgiveness or her time. Her energy was better directed towards systemic change than individual redemption. Some people disagreed with that decision. They believed forgiveness and grace were important, but Alicia's reasoning was valid. Black women already spend enough time managing other people's emotions. Sometimes the right choice is to focus on yourself and your community. The security contractor lost 2 additional hospital contracts in the year after the incident. Word spread across the healthcare industry. Hospitals didn't want to risk similar situations. The contractor eventually shut down. A new company took over their accounts, and that company made diversity training and proper staff identification top priorities. That's the ripple effect of accountability. One incident handled correctly can reshape an entire industry's approach to a problem, but only if the person experiencing discrimination has the resources, awareness, and determination to push for real change, and only if institutions are willing to take the issue seriously. Alicia still works at St. Catherine's. She is now being considered for a CEO role at a larger hospital system. Her reputation in healthcare leadership has continued to grow. She is often invited to speak at conferences about diversity in healthcare, leadership, and building inclusive environments in medical settings. In those talks, she always brings up that morning with Blake, not because it was the worst thing she's ever experienced. It wasn't, but because it perfectly represents what many professionals of color face every day. The assumptions, the extra scrutiny, the burden of proving you belong in spaces where you absolutely do. She tells audiences that the goal isn't to punish every Blake in the world. The goal is to create systems where Blake's assumptions never turn into discriminatory actions, where proper training and clear procedures prevent bias from shaping how people are treated, where diversity isn't just a buzzword, but a lived reality at every level of an organization. Final question for you watching. If you were in Alicia's position, would you have filed the lawsuit or handled it internally? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Here's what makes this story both frustrating and hopeful. Frustrating because Alicia had to go through this, because she had to spend time and energy fighting discrimination, while also doing her demanding job of running the medical operations of an entire hospital. Because she had to document, prove, and fight for something that should have been obvious, that she belonged there. But hopeful because she prevailed. Because the system, though imperfect, eventually responded. Because one person with knowledge, evidence, and determination was able to force institutional change. Because others in similar situations now have better protections in place. That's the balance we have to hold. Recognizing that the system is flawed while also understanding it can improve. Accepting that individuals shouldn't have to be heroes to receive fair treatment, while still acknowledging those who push back when necessary. The hallway outside the ICU at St. Catherine's looks the same as it did that Wednesday morning. The same walls, the same lighting, the same nurses' station. But something fundamental changed there. A clear message was sent. You cannot make assumptions about who belongs based on appearance. You cannot selectively apply rules based on race. And if you do, there will be consequences. Blake learned that lesson the hard way. The security contractor learned it. The hospital learned it. And hopefully everyone watching this video is learning it as well. Rights only matter when people are willing to defend them. Policies only work when they are applied fairly. Change only happens when people are willing to fight for it. Thanks for staying with this story until the end. If you found it valuable, if it taught you something or made you think differently, please subscribe to this channel. We share these stories because they matter. Because knowledge is power. Because accountability is essential. Because change is possible when people refuse to accept discrimination. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video. Leave a comment about what you learned. And remember, if you're ever treated like you don't belong somewhere you absolutely do, you have every right to be there. You have options. Document everything. Know your rights. Follow through. And don't be afraid to hold people accountable for discriminatory actions. That's not being difficult. That's demanding the basic respect every person deserves. That's how we build workplaces and societies where people are judged by their qualifications and character, not by assumptions based on appearance. See you in the next one.